My name is Conrad Stump with the Local History and Genealogy Department of the Springfield-Greene County Library. I want to thank you all for joining us for our program this evening, part of our Civil War Symposium. John Rutherford is unable to be with us this evening, but we are very pleased to welcome retired Missouri State Professor Bill Piston, co-author of We Gave Them Thunder. So please join me in welcoming Bill Piston.
I want to begin by thanking the Library Center for making it possible to be here and be part of this wonderful symposium that has been going on, celebrating the anniversary of the Battle of Springfield, the Battle of Hartville, and other events. And, well, oh, the other thing I wanted to do. How many people here are either from Hartville or have some connection with Hartville? Quite a few. Quite a few. Well, glad to have you here, and I've already talked to some people with family connections in Hartville. One of the things I find whenever I talk about the Civil War is how much it remains family history to so many people and in so many ways. Well, this is the second half, really, of a talk that John and I started on Saturday with the story of Marmaduke's raid in southwest Missouri, producing two battles, Battle of Springfield and Battle of Hartville. I want to just briefly go over what that raid's about for those people who were not here on Saturday and bring you up to speed, and then talk about Marmaduke's fighting at Hartville. So, there we go. Marmaduke's raid, a raid of a Confederate cavalry unit that was part of the Trans-Mississippi Army, the army that had been assigned to defend Arkansas. That Confederate army met defeat at the Battle of Prairie Grove on December 7, 1862, and suffered another setback when the supply base at Van Buren, Arkansas was raided by Union troops and burned. This left the Army of the Trans-Mississippi, commanded by Thomas C. Hindman, in terrible condition, without supplies and in poor shape, with a federal force occupying much of northwest Arkansas. To deal with this crisis, Hindman turned to his trusted cavalry commander, John Sappington Marmaduke, and asked him to undertake a raid that would be against enemy supply lines. Now, raids are nothing new with cavalry. Up to this point in the Civil War, all kinds of raids had been launched. This one was a little unusual. It was one of the few that had a truly strategic objective. It was not meant merely to burn enemy supplies and to irritate them. It was not meant merely to panic the enemy. The hope was that Marmaduke could cause such damage to Union supply lines that the Union forces in Arkansas would have to pull back up into Missouri. In other words, that Marmaduke's raid might be able to accomplish what Hindman had not been able to accomplish at the Battle of Prairie Grove. It was a particularly desperate move because just before he received orders to make this raid, Marmaduke had sent a communication to Hindman letting him know that the cavalry brigade was in absolutely deplorable condition. Having fought at Prairie Grove and a couple of engagements before that, he said, our horses are completely worn out. About a third of his cavalry brigade had no horses whatsoever and were out of action till they could be had. Saddles, stirrups, things were worn out. The horses were unshod. They were malnourished. He said the brigade needs lots of rest. And it's right after sending off that letter that he gets an order from Hindman that says, basically, go up into Missouri, strike at the supply lines. I trust you as an officer to pick the targets that will work out best. The supply line he was talking about is the road running from St. Louis down to Fort Smith, Arkansas, which was the major transportation corridor inside the interior lines of what we call the Trans-Mississippi Theater of the Civil War. The main focus of the Union Army was to open up the Mississippi River, but the back door to this was the railroad running from St. Louis to Rolla, and then the rugged, unpaved road running from Rolla all the way down to Fort Smith, Arkansas. Missouri's interior and Arkansas's interior had to be kept safe by the Union in order for them to be free to operate and continue the campaigns that they began in 1862 on the Mississippi River and would culminate in July of 1863 with their capture of Vicksburg. So from 1861 until 1863, there was a series of engagements as North and South struggled over this corridor. And the famous battles you see, Wilson's Creek, Pea Ridge, Prairie Grove, all of those took place on this particular corridor as things shifted back and forth. The Union forces, recognizing the importance of this corridor, in February of 1862 made a concerted effort to push the Confederates out and down into Arkansas. That resulted in the Battle of Pea Ridge. Hindman had threatened that Union success the following December with his battle at Prairie Grove, but having failed that, he was pushed down to the Arkansas River into the area around Lewisburg and in desperate straits. What he wanted Marmaduke to do then is to come up into Missouri and pick some target on here that would cause the Union forces to pull major forces back. Everyone knew the next target of the Union was going to be Little Rock. And they could get to Little Rock by rivers, they could get to by using this corridor. What can the Confederates do? Well, a raid is better than nothing. And so he chose John Marmaduke. Marmaduke organized his forces into two columns. One was commanded by himself, and it consisted of a brigade commanded by Joe Shelby. And you see here, as I have given you the order of battle, the troops under Shelby's command following the war, not during it, Shelby's brigade would get the nickname the Iron Brigade, but that was made up after the war. Well-deserved for Shelby's hard-fighting brigade, but it's not one that they had during the war itself. Just as the famous guerrilla Bloody Bill Anderson was not known as Bloody Bill Anderson during the Civil War. He didn't get that nickname until post-war writings. Shelby's brigade and one separate regiment that had been attached to him under a commander named Colonel Emmett McDonald. Those were under his direct command. And then another column under Joseph C. Porter that was located a little to the southeast. These units, and again this command shows what's on your card, these units are usually known by the names of their commanders. They sometimes have numbers, and in fact many of them had several different numerical designations during the course, making it extremely difficult to study. They are sometimes, and this makes it even more confusing, known by a former commander's name rather than the current commander's name. But you see Shelby's brigade there, McDonald's regiment, and Porter's column. A large number of these troops had actually been recruited behind enemy lines in the summer of 1862 and had come back into Arkansas and were very, very anxious to do anything they could to reverse fortunes and try and get Confederates back into Missouri. So, just before the end of the year, Marmaduke got his orders and he moved in two columns, his own column moving through Yellville and moving north, Porter's column moving from Pocahontas, and the plan was that they would meet on January 9th at Hartville, Missouri. But while Marmaduke was on the way, some of his, quote, scouts and spies, how we wish we knew more than just that phrase, he got information that the garrison at Springfield was weak. And this was key information because Springfield was home to tons of supplies, food, clothing, ammunition, and hundreds of horses. It was the major place where horses were rehabilitated. To keep supplies available to the armies that were in northwest Arkansas, hundreds of wagons moved back and forth, literally 24 hours a day, from the railhead at Rolla down to the area around Fayetteville. Well, a Union Army Civil War supply wagon could haul about 2 tons, and if you go more than 5 days, you have to use almost all of the storage space in the wagon for the fodder for the horses. So, to operate an army, you can't operate very far from supply depots if they're not. So Springfield is where tons of supplies were built up and then would be hauled by wagon. So this made Springfield a natural target. Marmaduke sent word to Porter by messengers, change of plan. Come meet me, I'm going to attack Springfield. And Marmaduke approached Springfield on the morning of the 8th of January, hoping, as he approached Springfield from the south, that Porter would have gotten his message and he would approach Springfield from the east. That produced a battle at Springfield. Springfield defended by a Union garrison and local militia that eventually numbered some 2,000 men, giving them actually a slight superiority over the 1,888 men in Marmaduke's column. Porter's column numbered 850 when he began, but 150 of his men had to turn back just after they got into Missouri because their horses were worn out. But Marmaduke ended up attacking Springfield with just over 1,800 men. When he attacks on foot, 1 man in 4 has to be absent holding the horses. So Marmaduke attacked Springfield with the smaller force and with a really limited ammunition supply because the troops carried only what they could carry on their horses. It was a battle that began, began about 10:30 in the morning, but serious fighting began about 1 o'clock and went on until dark. Porter never showed up to Marmaduke's dismay. The Confederate troops pushed into Springfield almost as far as the town square. And had things gone a little differently, it might have been a victory for the South, but it was not. And the Southern troops pulled back, leaving pickets out to watch the edge of the city. The Southern forces pulled back to a farm that was in the hands of a Union congressman who was absent in St. Louis raising troops. His name was John S. Phelps, and after the war, his family plantation of him and Mary Whitney Phelps would become Phelps Grove Park. So that's where the Southerners go back to. And that is where, here I lost my page. Okay, excuse me. All right, well, did I give you the wrong one? There, that's got the one. I was going to quote something here, but I wrote down the page. Yeah, you know I've done that before. Bet you're wondering what that was about. Well, after the war, the adjutant who served under Shelby would write in a book about Shelby and his men that the Confederates showed great respect for the property of John Phelps. They burned his rails because they needed to do that, his fence rails. They needed to do that to stay warm, but otherwise they did not touch the property even though he was, a congressman and on the wrong side and a major leader of the Union side. Well, it so happens that a letter exists from a visitor to Springfield who was in Springfield. She was a school teacher briefly and then left shortly after the battle. And she wrote a letter back to her friends in Virginia. It was published in a Virginia newspaper. And she visited the Phelps farm and the family. It's not a big plantation, it's a farmhouse. But she went to see that. And here's her description of what it looked like at the Phelps place after the Confederates got through. So she says, "I cannot describe to you the state of confusion everything was in. Such a general upturning, overhauling, and ransacking had been through that house. The bureau drawers containing Mrs. P's, Mrs. Phelps's, fine summer clothing had been taken out and their contents were strewn on the floor. Her box of jewelry containing some elegant bracelets, rings, pins, etc., her massive silver pitcher and plate, spoons, knives, and forks were gone. Sealed cans of fruit, nowhere to be found. Hams and other meat had disappeared from the smokehouse. A barrel of sugar and salt, 2 barrels of mackerel, all taken. Empty bottles were lying over the floors in nearly every room, and beds were relieved of blankets, quilts, and sheets. Even dishes from the cupboards were taken down and broken and scattered over the floor." So, the behavior of Shelby's men was not quite as perfect as in song and story, but that makes them no different. You can find many, many examples of looting on both sides in the Civil War. But it is a reminder that when people write their memoirs, they do tend to put their best picture for it on them and their side. Again, very understandable. So, Marmaduke has fought a battle, wakes up, it is now the 9th of January, what to do? He has no idea what has happened to Porter. And after making, at least by one account, a rather pretentious offer to accept the surrender of the garrison of Springfield, if they would now like to give up, having fought all the previous day, and getting an answer no, heads off to the east and towards Hartville. And here you see the road network. Here is Springfield. Here is Hartville. There was a major Union garrison at Houston, and that would be plot material. And you know, there's just a whole roadway network here in very many different ways you could get to be someplace. So, the idea, head to Hartville, see if he can find what had happened to Joseph Porter. As they went and took the road up initially towards Lebanon and then went to Marshfield and headed on toward Hartville, one of the things they did was cut down the telegraph lines leading up to St. Louis, cut down the telegraph lines just for several miles, and then left them in the middle of the roadway to entangle anyone who was following them. And some of the Union troops following them in the dark did get entangled. The Union pursuit was cautious. As Marmaduke pulled off, some troops from Springfield followed him a little way, saw that yes, indeed, they're really going away, they're not going to turn back and attack us, and they went back to Springfield to deal with everything necessary there. As a result of the battle, the fortifications that had been built in Springfield would be strengthened. Some additional fortifications would be built. The question came up Saturday, if you're not familiar, the Civil War fortifications that are visible on the Drury campus still, that you can see just a few of, and that they had some archaeological excavations. Those were built after the Battle of Springfield to protect the roadway network leading northwest out of the city. So they are Civil War fortifications, but no shots were ever actually fired against those. No remnants of the forts that existed at the time of the Battle of Springfield still exist. Well, it had been a relatively bloody battle. You see the casualties down here at the bottom, and casualty figures for this battle are just, the sources differ. Each side, in calculating these casualty figures, left out some regiments which we know had casualties. So these represent an estimate. But you can see there the Confederate losses at Springfield and the Union losses at the Battle of Springfield, why hardly the size of the Battle of Gettysburg were certainly significant. The main point is, though, the losses were not so great that Marmaduke would not consider continuing on his raid. Well, what was Porter doing? On his way up from the area of Pocahontas, he had moved, originally intending to go around West Plains, got information that there was a major garrison there. There wasn't really a big garrison, but then decided to skip that and move on and come up to Hartville more or less from the south. As he was doing so, his column encountered the same conditions that Marmaduke's men had encountered coming up from Arkansas. They encountered a lot of rain and some sleet. There would not be significant snow falling on the raiders until their trip back. But it was cold for much of the raid. And then the days around January 8th, a little bit of a warming spell. But by the 9th and the 10th, it was starting to turn much colder again. Marmaduke got to Hartville, the county seat of Wright County. Which had a small Union garrison there, which he had no trouble capturing. There was no major fortification there. The courthouse was a very small brick building, and a relatively flimsy wooden palisade had been placed around it. And the Confederates simply knocked that down, and then headed out towards the road that would take them to Springfield, looking for Marmaduke, trying to find out what was happening. And the two forces ran into each other on the 10th, on the road between Marshfield and Hartville, had a conversation what to do, and the decision was, well, we'll continue on the raid, see what we're going to do. Best thing to do, though, now is go back to Hartville. And the reason is, Hartville was the site of the Beaumont Mill, and they needed the grain. If you're talking about Civil War infantry troops, a regiment of, say, some 600 to 800 men with its attached forces, those men consume 1.5 tons of food a day on minimum rations, whether they move forward or sit still. By Army regulations, horses are supposed to have 26 pounds of food a day, half grain, half fodder. You have to graze a horse for 4 hours to give it minimal nutrition. You can't have a raid and rely on your horses eating grass after you stop for the night. So the Confederates had been confiscating food every place they could go to, and they wanted to go back to Hartville rather than proceed on directly to Rolla or any other part of the major supply line to get grain at the Beaumont Mill. So going back to Hartville made sense. Well, meanwhile, what's the Union doing? The Confederates actually had not cut the telegraph line running from Springfield up to St. Louis until late in the afternoon of the 8th of January. The telegraph line originally ran, the first telegraph ran from Springfield actually north up to Tipton and then along the Missouri River to St. Louis. During the war, they strung telegraph lines that ran along the route to Rolla. This line was not cut until 3 o'clock, so the authorities in St. Louis, the Union Department Commander Samuel Ryan Curtis, knew what was happening, knew that the Yankees there, the federal forces there in Springfield were under attack, and began alerting people all throughout Missouri that Springfield is in danger. Send what you can to go to help them. He didn't have much information because then the lines fell silent, so he wrote his orders in a way that gave discretion to local commanders. Send what help to Springfield you think you can. And one of the people who responded was the Union commander, Henry Fitzwarren, in Houston, Missouri. He says, this is a crisis. Our fellow Union garrison commanders there in Springfield, they need help. We've got to move absolutely as quickly as we can. So he took a large portion of the garrison and said, we've got to get to Springfield. He was ill. So he turned the command over to one of his subordinates, Samuel Merrill, I'll show his picture in a minute, and gave him some 500 infantrymen, about between 150 to 200 cavalrymen, sources aren't more exact, and a section, meaning two guns of artillery. Union artillery batteries usually consisted of 6 guns divided into 2 sections, means 2 artillery pieces. Well, again, this is through rugged Ozarks country, and they need to take food with them to Springfield. They don't know what's going to happen. They don't know anything, or maybe Springfield's been captured. So they take a baggage train with them, ordinary wagons with some food in them. Ordinary procedure. What Warren does next is, to my knowledge, a first in American military history, to use wagons in this particular sense. He deliberately sends along extra wagons that are empty. And the purpose of these extra wagons is to try and increase the pace of the infantry. The plan is that, of course, the cavalry can move faster, infantry moving as fast as it can, that the infantrymen will take turns riding in the wagons, so that some of them can, on rotation, get rest, and hopefully the whole force can go further than it would than if every infantryman had to walk without getting a rest. And they made a very, very powerful walk for the first day and a half. Again, I've never known this being used before in American military history, nor does it seem to have caught on. I don't know of another example any time in the Civil War. But it was a very innovative response to the crisis when someone says you need to get people there very quickly. Here's someone General Warren. He doesn't end up leading the battle. It's going to be Colonel Merrill. But he certainly does everything he could as a commander to try and assist his fellow soldiers when they were in trouble. Merrill's command, again, you have there on your handout, so I'm not going to go into great detail, other than, as I said, it's 2 infantry units, 2 cavalry units, and a battery. The 99th Illinois and excuse me, the 21st Iowa were relatively green regiments. The 3rd Iowa Cavalry and 3rd Missouri had seen some significant action. Battery L, the 2nd Missouri, those 2 guns under Lieutenant Walsmith had seen very little action. So it's a mixed force. Some people who are veterans and some for whom this is likely to be their first fight. If they run into anybody, but they're going down the road, Missouri back roads, without any idea if they're going to run into anyone at all. Well, they get to Hartville. And, let's see, the map back up on this one. No, oh, here's Merrill. Here is Cornelius Dunlap. He is the commander there of the 21st Iowa, and he will play a particular role in this battle. Neither one of them, both civilians, lawyers, merchants, no serious combat experience up to this point. Both of them will end up performing very well. Go back to this now. Well, they move out of Houston, and they get to Hartville and find out, hey, the Confederates have passed through here. They've moved through here and are heading to the west towards Springfield. Who are these? Don't know. They actually capture a couple of prisoners who give, as prisoners often do, exaggerated reports. Oh, we're here raiding Missouri. We've got 5,000–6,000 men. It is likely that Merrill had enough experience to realize that you need to take such reports with a cake of salt. But anyway, it's clearly not a small force. He decides, though, to push on past Hartville, and pushes on, and then finally decides, I've got to rest my men, and he stops at a place where he can get good water for his men, and it's a place where the roadway running from Hartville up to Marshfield crosses a body of water known as Woods Fork of the Gasconade River. And we begin the Battle of Hartville with an encounter fight. During January 10th, Marmaduke and Porter got together. Decided they'd turn around and go back to Hartville. And so back to Hartville they are going on the Hartville-Marshville Road. While they're on their way, Porter's men get to this significant road junction, camp here, and send some pickets, very intelligently, send some in on the far side of the ford, so that if anyone is coming, they will run into them. And the two forces collide in the dark. And they collide, according to the people who were there, at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 5 o'clock, and 4 o'clock. I've rarely seen sources get these written within days of the battle with such a discrepancy about what time it was. All I can say is, well, it was dark, so if you've got a pocket watch, it's going to be difficult to see. People don't synchronize their pocket watch. Anyway, so sometime in the middle of the night, but it's after midnight, so it is now the 11th. It is now the 11th of January. The two forces run into each other, and there is a rare, significant engagement in the dark. So there are really two parts to the Battle of Hartville. One is this part that occurs at the ford of the Woods Fork of the Gasconade River. And confusingly, there's no town up there where the letter A is. There's nothing there but a few farms. And yet in some sources, they call that ford Woods Fork, as if it's a community, but it's not. So, some people will say there are actually two battles. There's a battle of Hartville and there's a battle of Woods Fork. But they're on the same day and it's all tied together. So I think that this is part one of the battle of Hartville. So the two forces collide with each other in the dark. Each side sends out some forces to probe ahead and see what is happening. Once it is clear that somebody is there, the Union forces on the far side of the ford send back to Merrill and let him know, hey, the people up front, it's a big force. He starts getting everybody out of camp. So they will come up and try and defend the far side of that ford. Meanwhile, well, the Southern cavalry column that has been coming down the road now numbers some 2,500 men as Porter and Marmaduke are linked up. If they were going by parade ground precision, which they certainly weren't, they would have taken up 2 miles of space on the road, and it would have taken 45 minutes after the head of the column passed one place for the rear of the column to get there. Actually, we know they sent some men far ahead as quickly as they could to try and reach the Beaumont Mill. And these are the first ones that bumped into the Union pickets. But as they come up, it is Porter's men who are in the lead, and Shelby's men who are at the rear. And they come up, and Porter makes a decision to engage, and they begin putting, each side begins putting troops out on both sides of this little one-lane country road, and they begin shooting each other in the dark. And as I said, each side is interested in finding exactly what the enemy's position has looked like, and the way you do that is to send people out. So, when you say send people out, what you mean is some poor private has got to go out and find out what's going on. Find my place here. Norman Hall, in the 3rd Iowa Cavalry, wrote a letter that was published in his hometown newspaper, which was a lot more honest than a lot of 19th century soldiers were about what it was like to participate in combat. Because his unit, his company, his little squadron got the assignment, you go down the road. And here's what he's saying. It may be easy for a brave man to march forward in daylight to meet his foe, whom he can see, but not so easy to grope his way through the woods in utter darkness, feeling as it were for the enemy, and expecting every moment to be shot at by an unseen foe with no opportunity for self-defense. The order simply means, go ahead until they shoot you, and then we'll know where they are. That's pretty rare honesty for 19th century soldiers. Well, as the battle develops, as more and more of the Confederate column pulls up, Marmaduke has a decision to make, what to make. Expected just to go back to Hartville, grind some grain, and then maybe they're going to go strike back at the corridor there. Someone brings him information. How I wish I could find out. How John and I wish we could find out who brought this information. But it simply says, someone brought him information that he was being followed by a large Union force. He'd known that he'd been probed briefly as he left Springfield, but hadn't seen him in a while. And then now he becomes concerned. He doesn't have a clue. It's dark. He doesn't know how many people are there on the far side of the ford. Just everybody shooting each other in the dark. Now he's told there's a big force in his rear. What to do? What he decided to do is he doesn't want to get caught in a pincher movement. But he has an opportunity, and it's what's known as the Old Springfield Road. And what he decided to do is leave Porter's forces engaged, up here where you see the A, and he would take the rest of his men, McDonald's regiment, Shelby's brigade, and follow what's called the Old Springfield Road, and reach Hartville from the south. And you see he will have a much greater distance to go than the distance that Merrill had followed. And so he needs to try and fool Merrill and get there ahead of him. So he left Porter behind, and they're making a lot of noise, and it works. The Confederates break off. Shelby's men move down the Old Springfield Road. Just after it's beginning to get light, Porter begins to pull off, and Merrill is for a while confused. He even sends some troops to follow them, enough that Shelby detaches some men and fights with them briefly, and then Merrill realizes, wait a minute, they can get to Hartville before I can. And again, he doesn't have the information other than He's seeing a lot of Confederates in the dark, and he's got a lot of report. How many are there? Well, thousands. He doesn't know what's happened to Springfield. He has no information. So, well, where does safety lie? He doesn't know what happens if he goes that way. That's towards Springfield in danger. He decides he better get to Hartville first because his home base is Houston this way. And worst case scenario, he can go up to Lebanon where there's another garrison. So it turns out to be a race as Merrill turns around and rushes back towards Hartville and as the Confederates move this way. Well, it will be a dead heat. And what the map here shows is, before I go to a close-up, what happens is the Southerners, the Confederates, approach Hartville from the south, just as the Union forces are approaching from this way, and they actually get to the high ground above Hartville, just as the Southerners are crossing the dry fork of the Woods Fork of the Gasconade and are coming into Hartville. Well, the Union intelligently had their artillery moving at the head of the column as they returned, and are able to place artillery up on the high ground. We'll show another close-up in a minute. On the high ground above Hartville. Again, Shelby, arriving from the south, begins to deploy and will move his forces. And when it's in close-up maps, they're going to deploy in the ground here that is low ground, where the Woods Fork, Woods Fork makes kind of an L. As they come up this road, Marmaduke orders Shelby to go towards Hartville. Shelby to go towards Hartville, orders in the rear. Two of the artillery pieces, along with Shelby and his column, he sends to a ridge that overlooks Hartville. And if you've ever been there, I think it's called Steele's Bluff today. There's a post-Civil War mansion that's up there. The last time I was up there was for sale. Anyway, it gives you a magnificent view of the whole town. And up there, you are at long-range artillery shot. You have a 12-pounder and a 6-pounder, and you can hit here, and even a little further. But it is really, really long range. But it provides cover for Shelby and his men as they begin to arrive. McDonald's regiment is next in line, and they get the assignment to go over the ridge and to go to the next ford, and this is a blocking line. Block this ford here so that if any Federals are still in Houston and are trying to reinforce, they're going to be blocked. As the artillery is deployed by the Federals, the leading cavalry unit initially goes this way, runs into McDonald, realizes the route to Houston is blocked, pulls back and takes up a position where they are guarding the Lebanon road, so that if it's necessary for the Union to retreat, their line of retreat, they have a guard in that way. So this is the scenario as the two forces run into each other. And one of the most confusing things about the Battle of Hartville is there is a reference to a mounted fight in the streets of Hartville at the very beginning. And there's some sketchy descriptions, and it's unclear who that would be and how many would have been involved. But a fight there between mounted troops is the only mounted fight of the battle that apparently does not last very long, and then both sides pull back. Well, Hartville. What's Hartville like, where this fight is going to take place? Here we go. Sorry, the right page number. Here we go. Sorry. The little community was bordered on the south and the east by Woods Fork, like an L tilted on its left. The stream then turned sharply to the east again. A prominent bluff ran parallel to a portion of Woods Fork east of Hartville on the bank opposite the town. Hartville itself, with its central Wright County courthouse, sat on the slope of a large wooded hill that rose to the northwest. White settlement in Wright County dated to the 1830s. John Tyler's Longhouse Saloon was the first structure established in what would become Hartville, followed about 1840 by another saloon operated by William Tucker. John M. Gorman brought respectability when he opened the general store in 1843, and the town grew. By 1855, it boasted two modest hotels, both run by women, actually. There were Baptist and Methodist churches. The town was incorporated in 1851 with streets measuring 60 feet wide. By 1860, Hartville counted among its 113 residents 3 lawyers, 3 blacksmiths, as well as 2 each of merchants, millers, physicians, and shoemakers. Local entrepreneurs included a wheelwright, carpenter, grocer, teamster, engineer, innkeeper, and a clerk of court. There was also a tailoress, who will be soon to be a seamstress. And then there was the mill by the Beaumont family. So not a large community, but one that was certainly very thriving. There were a very, very small African-American population. Well, as the battle unfolds, the Union artillery takes a position in the high ground, and Merrill deploys his men, and the biggest factor affecting this battle is going to be that this position is actually rather heavily wooded with scrub trees and things, particularly undergrowth, so that when the Union troops melt down, they virtually disappear. And this makes a difference because there are less than 1,000 Union troops, and they're facing a force much greater than they are. And in this situation, the Union artillery, infantry, and the cavalry, which soon dismount, stretch out in a single line. Most Civil War forces are a double line and are close packed together. They spread out. And they even take the risk, all the cavalrymen get off their horses and tie them up to trees and things. That's a bad idea because if the horses spook, they run off. Why do you leave 1 man and 4 holding a horse rather than tied up? Because you really want those horses to be available to you if you need them. So they're taking risks, they're spread in a thin line, and throughout the battle, the Confederates will never realize how few they are. They will never realize how spread out they are because of the terrain. Never realize that they're in a single line of battle. The other thing that is affecting the battle on the southern side is exhaustion. Now, Merrill's men are tired too. They've made this long track from Houston, turned back. Everybody's been running as fast as they can to get back to Hartville. But the Raiders have been going since just after New Year's. And Shelby's men had shot up most of their ammunition in the Battle of Springfield. Collins's artillery, which I mentioned, is firing solid shot, not explosive shells, because they used up all their explosive shells in the battle. So it's a battle in which the Southerners don't have a single round to spare, and everybody on both sides is very tired. And so you begin with an uncoordinated attack that passes through Hartville and approaches the lines as the Southerners dismount. So their horses are back, actually 1/4 of the forces are back here, and they make an uncoordinated assault around noon, which is pushed back, and they regroup in the low ground here. Well, then Porter arrives. He comes up. He's last in the column. Remember I said 45 minutes if you were all packed together by military discipline. So he's at the tail end of the line. Finally gets and comes in this way. And his initial position, Marmaduke puts him here. Deploy here. And if he'd done so, as originally intended, Porter's men would have seriously overlapped this line, and had there been a concerted attack where Porter and Shelby attacked at the same time, almost certainly would have just collapsed this and would have won a major Union victory, as they closed on the flank and that single line would have collapsed. But then, happenstance can play a great role. Somebody, I wish we could identify which officer, The word came to Marmaduke. Marmaduke says, I received word that the Union was retreating. Well, they weren't, and they weren't, because, go back to the previous one of the things that concerned Merrill is what to do with that baggage train he'd been dragging around behind him. And he becomes almost obsessively concerned with it and decides he's going to send it partially cross country and following just a few rows so that he can get it up to the Lebanon Road, which means crossing some terrible ravines. So he begins a slow movement, and his job is to basically buy time till the wagons can get here, and then he can retreat everybody to Lebanon. That's his plan for this battle. And it works in that the baggage train begins making this slow trek. Well, back there on the hill, Collins' artillery, he could see that baggage train in the distance, and in fact fired a few shots that even reached it, one of which took the back legs off one of the mules pulling one of the wagons. But he thinks it's the whole Union Army is pulling off, the whole Union force. And so word reaches Marmaduke, apparently from Collins, they're leaving. So instead of having Porter here, Marmaduke countermands the orders. Tells Porter, you need to go up the Lebanon Road as quickly as you can and prevent the enemy from escaping. So Porter, instead of dismounting and being in line of battle and having one out of four men, everybody mounts back up with his artillery, and they drive up the road this way. And as they do so, all nice packed dense in a column, they come right up close to where the Union has where Merrill has dismounted his cavalry, which even pull up right to the edge of the road, and they blast Porter's men if they're on horseback. And the Union are armed with Sharp's carbines, which are a breech loader, which they can easily fire 2 shots a minute. And if you're really, really anxious and you're good, you can get off 4 shots a minute, but you can easily get off 2. And it's in close range. And Porter's column simply falls apart, and Brown's artillery is left abandoned. Well, so this represents Porter. He's come back in complete disgrace. Leading that artillery is considered a particular disgrace to lose your artillery. One of the strangest things in this particular battle is that Marmaduke, Emmett McDonald, I noticed his regiment was sent up there to block the road to Houston. McDonald had been riding not at the head of his column, but towards the middle or rear. And by the time he reaches Marmaduke, his sub-commander, his lieutenant colonel, has been given the order, and he learns, oh, my unit's been told to go over there and guard something. So he makes an unusual request to Marmaduke. Can I leave my unit in command in my second command, and can I go personally take part in this battle? And Marmaduke says, well, that's very irregular, but go ahead. And so McDonald goes and joins the battle, and what he did up to this point is not clear. But once he sees Brown's artillery has been abandoned, he rallies some troops. They're back down in the low ground here below the town. Rallies some troops, and they go up and do manage to drag the artillery pieces back and save them. But in the course of which, McDonald is mortally wounded. To support this, when Shelby sees there's a rescue going on to save the artillery, he makes another attack. And by this time, the Union forces, again, are thin, but have deployed. So now, instead of being taken on the flank, as they would be if Porter had been there, they've extended their flank, and Shelby's attack, even though the number of guns fired against them is not very great, they are able to hit his flank. And again, the Confederates do not understand they're facing such a small force. So, finally, the last part of the battle, just before darkness comes, Brown's artillery, the artillery that was accompanying Porter, does begin to engage and fire on the Union flank. But by that time, orders have come to withdraw. and orders reach everyone except Colonel Dunlap. Colonel Dunlap, as you see there, is commanding the 21st Iowa. The messenger that was sent to Dunlap didn't reach him. And remember, these Union lines have been spread out thin, so somehow he didn't get the message. And suddenly, just as about to be dark, there are only about 250 Union infantrymen facing 2,500 Confederates. But they're concealed in the woods, and it's growing dark, and Shelby never learns, Marmaduke never learns, they could have just obviously rolled over them. Dunlap wasn't too happy about having been left behind, but he eventually draws his people on up the road to Lebanon, and everyone escapes. Each side claims that they were the last to leave town. Marmaduke claims that they were held in town long enough to take some supplies and things and get back with them. The Union forces say we were the last to leave town, and both sides left physicians behind to treat the wounded. Both sides end up cooperating in that. We know that there were 10 physicians attached to the regiments that accompanied this raid. But we don't know if those 10 physicians actually went on the raid. We know of only a couple by name. We know that some physicians, Confederate physicians, remained behind in Springfield. And we know some remained behind in Hartville, but we don't know who they are. But we do know that both sides cooperated. The weather had turned cold. Neither side was prepared to treat the casualties adequately. And one Union soldier writes back in a letter that, lacking any other way to take care of the enemy's casualties, we piled leaves over the Confederate wounded to try and keep them warm. It doesn't take Pickett's charge. It doesn't take the big battles to bring home the poignancy of what it means to participate. For these soldiers who were in this battle, this was the Civil War. You couldn't tell them that someone else's experience was worse. Equal maybe, but when you're in the battle and you're wounded, have to be covered with leaves to stay warm, that's just about as bad as the war can get. Well, at that point, Marmaduke decides to go back to Arkansas. Was it worth it? Was it worth it? Well, this is what Marmaduke claimed his casualties were, and you'll notice they're different from the casualty figures I've got there, which are my best attempt. But all of these, some units made no reports. Marmaduke claimed, well, he actually moved over 300 miles, he claimed fewer than that they captured 300 prisoners along the way, all of whom were paroled. Have no evidence from the Union side that many were captured. But again, not every unit reporting, probably an exaggeration. During the Battle of Springfield, they captured one piece of Union artillery, which they took back to Arkansas. The main accomplishment of the raid, as far as the Confederates were concerned, is that several thousand Northern troops were ordered from Arkansas back to Missouri. Several thousand came back to Springfield as quickly as they could. In other words, it had the effect the raid was intended to be. It took Union forces in large numbers and drew them back into Missouri. Tens of thousands of men make a retrograde motion, and 2,500 Confederates caused this. It's worth the effort. It's worth the effort from that point of view. It's worth the effort for the casualties from that point of view. By the time Marmaduke's column got back to Arkansas, some 200 of them were on foot. Their horses had simply died along the way. Marmaduke claimed that one of the great things he did was revive Confederate hopes in Missouri. For those people in Missouri who wanted Missouri to be a Confederate state, and their hopes were revived. And indeed they were. You can't measure that. What we can say in ending this is there's no direct evidence that this inspired other raids. There's no institutional mechanism, North and South, for commanders to learn from each other. There's no way in which you accumulate knowledge. This is how to conduct a raid. And we study these raids to make a better raid later in the war. Some generals we know behave like this. We know Robert E. Lee, for instance, met with his generals and discussed the campaigns that had just occurred and discussed what they'd done and what they could learn from the just past campaign. But there's no mechanism in which someone on the other side of the Mississippi River can learn anything from what Marmaduke did. What we can say is subsequent raids that took place in the Trans-Mississippi indicate that some knowledge is gained. Shelby and Marmaduke both continued to make other raids, and if they didn't end up changing the course of the war for the Confederacy, they were still probably the most effective use of the force that the Confederates could make at the time. So, Marmaduke's Southwest Missouri raid produces two battles that have unjustly been forgotten. They are battles that are small on the scale of other things, but as I said, for the soldiers who fought there, the courage they displayed was equal to this courage on any other battlefield. For the families that suffered when their soldiers, their loved ones died, for the civilians in Springfield and in Hartville who had battles occurring directly in their homes, this was war as awful as it got. So here we are on the anniversary of Hartville, just past the anniversary of Springfield, and I hope that what John and I have done here has done something that will help people remember that even though these are not the most famous battles of the Civil War, they are worthy of our study, and the people who fought them are worthy of our admiration. Thank you. I'm very sorry that John was not able to be here tonight, and you did not have the benefit of just talking about it, because this is a joint project, and we both enjoyed researching it together, and it's been a lot of fun for us.